Therapist Thrival Guide, where we cover all of the things that graduate school didn't teach you. Welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda Barker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Lucas Volini, LMFT.
Hello.
And we are here to continue our conversation about innovation in therapy and even more specifically, continue our conversation on technology in therapy. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about our virtual reality therapy program at Ellie, and we have LJ back today to talk more about technology in therapy. And we also have Dr. G here again.
Here I am.
Yeah, to talk more about this too and how he's seen this used with clients and kind of some of his feedback on it. So without
This is
further
going to
ado,
be a nerd fest.
Just prepare.
And LJ is my favorite nerd.
Well, so little context. After we filmed the VR therapy episode, I think we still
just
talked.
kept going.
We kept talking.
Yeah, we just kept talking for probably like an hour, just about, these different technologies you're seeing. Do you want to talk a little bit about the class that you're teaching too?
Sure.
Because I think that is a cool segue into this.
Yeah, sure. This last fall, I taught a course with Kyle Ross and Kyle Keller on emerging trends in psychotherapy. The Kyles took part of the course and did it on psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Which, to interrupt you, so you will recognize Kyle Ross's name because we've had him on several different of these podcasts, specifically the Navigating Tragedies one and also the psychedelic-assisted therapy one. Mm-hmm. And then Kyle Keller is actually he's the co-founder of Ellie Mental Health, and so that's how they fit into all of this.
Yeah, and so we kind of split it, and so they did part on psychedelic-assisted therapy, and then I did half the course on emerging trend or on integrating tech into therapy, and then we've been asked back by St. Mary's to teach it again here starting in May. So we're going to teach the course again, which is pretty cool.
Sign me up.
For real.
I'll audit it, right?
Actually,
that's what you do to take a course for free.
Kyle Minnis actually did. He actually sat in for it.
All right, I'll audit part 2.
Nice. And Kyle Minnis has been on the podcast too. It's kind of like a small world. and we're actually going to be releasing another episode with Kyle, I think next week, about family systems and family therapy.
Yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah, super cool one coming up.
And then, Dr. G, and a lot of your work in developing and establishing specialty programs, technology is always one of those things that, we have a lot of conversations about, needs to be evaluated in the sense of all the precautions, that need to be taken and considered before you start implementing new technologies into therapy. And so there could be a pretty rigorous process of scrutinizing the research and what's out there as you evaluate, whether or not this product has proved its merit, for implementation, or if it's something, we feel like we just need to pump the brakes on.
That's a really good segue into one of the first things that we want to talk about today is something called Endeavor RX. And it's the first FDA approved?
Yeah, it was actually the first FDA digital therapeutic of, I think it was around 2020, maybe a little bit before, they were the first to gain FDA approval for basically a video game. And so they created it to be able to take the kind of the established protocols for treating ADHD, like go, no go, task switching, things along those lines that therapists will be familiar with, and move that into a video game environment to be able to enhance that. And then as they did that, they actually gained FDA approval going through that whole vetting process, that's the first video game that actually you have to have a prescription to be able to play.
So Endeavor RX is for ADHD. Is it for any other diagnoses that you're aware of?
Primarily ADHD.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would someone go through, like if I don't know if Dr. G, you can speak to this too, or I don't know. But like if you're a 12-year-old kid or like maybe a 13-year-old kid or something, you're seeing a psychiatrist and is it a psychiatrist that would prescribe it?
Could be any doctor, right? I mean, anybody who has prescriptive authority. So, it could be a physician, it could be probably a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, right, in the locality where you're at. But, you got to get it. I mean, this is maybe part of the discussion too, right? I mean, there's pros and cons of kind of following. This is an example of following the systems that are already in place, like, the medical machinery, right? And so, obviously, people are trained in that and we understand it, and that's kind of how we use other therapeutics right now. There's a lot of ways where people are just going way outside of that, which is great too. And now it's like, well, you leave out all that access, right? So and the people who created Endeavor RX said, well, I don't like this work, so why don't we just go through all the work to prove it the way that we prove other things and try to get into that avenue, right? And so, which is great in a way that, the FDA looked at it just like they look at any other device and would have proven safety and efficacy in this specific population, but then now it's like FDA approved. So what does that mean? So that, so it's got an indication for ADHD for a specific age group, but it also means that you can prescribe it off label. So you can prescribe it for anything, but you need somebody who can prescribe. And then what does that mean? Well, that means that you get a prescription for it. You can't go to a pharmacy to fill this, right? You don't go to Walgreens.
Yeah.
And so they have, my understanding is they have a system set up where then you'd submit the prescription right to their distributor, which is basically their company, and then you can kind of get it. I don't know that insurance has covered it, but certainly they could choose to cover it as part of their kind of package now, and so then you got to pay for it however, and this whole kind of system, so it's nice in that it's gone through the work to prove safety and efficacy. You can talk to your doctor about it, and hopefully they'll be educated about it. But it's one of these things that any newer thing, you'll have to do some advocacy with your provider, and so you've gained access in that way. At the same time, like you said, you need a prescription for it now, right? So now it's like something that's proven safe and efficacious, you can't just get, right?
Yeah.
Now you have to go through a physician or a prescriber to get it. So it's double-edged sword in that way, right?
Yeah.
Why do you so the advantage to going through all of the process of FDA approval is really just to show that efficacy and to really establish it as this is something that works versus later in this episode we'll talk about Mightier, where similarly it's a video game and you can just sign up for that subscription too. And so I'm curious pros and cons of both ways.
No, I think that's a great discussion, and you can't put yourself in their shoes, but I would, I would assume that the biggest kind of benefits would be, you do it in a language that people already speak. So people who, commonly, if you're seeking treatment for ADHD, commonly you're going to go to the medical industry, and so you put something through that industry so that then people understand what that means, right? And then they can kind of build it into their practice and their treatment protocols. And then the other one has to be to try to eventually leverage payer coverage by the way that people would otherwise pay for their healthcare or prescriptions or visits, right? And so I don't know that it is right now, but certainly down that path is to try to get insurance coverage and get coverage just like you would pay for any other health condition.
I think part of it too is looking at the product, I can understand why they wanted to ensure that there was a mental health provider involved with the use of the product. And this is kind of what's going to differentiate it from Mightier and Endeavor RX, because Endeavor RX is really designed to be used in conjunction with therapy. Because part of it is that a lot of the telemetry data is being sent back to the provider to be able to use that as part of the ongoing therapy. So the way that it's designed is really for something to be able to facilitate and further treatment between therapy sessions. So often, when you think about from a therapist perspective, often enough we conclude a session and then we say, go forth into the world and please do these things and then let us know how it goes. And then we'll pick back up and make adjustments then when you come back in. What a tool like this does is it's designed really to be from the end of session to the next session that the kid, because this is designed between, I think, up until age about 13, is that the child is able to engage in therapy using the designed tools that we're looking at. And what it does is it will adjust the therapeutic intervention based on how the child is performing on those tasks. So rather than having to wait between sessions to be able to readjust where is the amount of therapeutic intervention that's occurring, video games are great at being able to scale. And so that is something that it's designed to be able to make those adjustments, to be able to keep the therapeutic intervention within kind of that zone of proximal learning. I mean, every field has got a different term for it, but it's that sweet spot between it's challenging enough that they're engaged, but it's not so difficult that they rage quit, that they're like, I'm out of here. And so it's able to do that fluctuation without the therapist because it has that kind of built-in tolerance of how much it can adjust without the therapist intervention. And so it's able to continue that therapy without the therapist involved, but then it's able to bring that telemetry data back in, because it's part of what's the appeal with that too is we always deal with self-report bias. How did it go between sessions? Kid says great, parent says awful. Sorry, which one's accurate? And they're both wrong. Of where we can use this then to be able to actually get an actual evaluation and then hear the self-reports, see where they differ, and be able to use all of that data. But it just to kind of separate out between, like, they're doing that little bit of gatekeeping, I think, to ensure that a mental health professional is involved with the process to be able to keep that on track.
Yeah.
Versus like Mightier, which can be used in conjunction with a therapist, or good luck, here you go, and which has its own benefits, but that's kind of the way that I separate out.
That makes so much sense. Yeah. No, and I appreciate that background. Do you know what Endeavor RX looks like? Have you seen any of the?
Yeah, there's actually there's a really great one. I can't remember the name of the guy. He does if you just Google or if you look on YouTube for Endeavor RX live gameplay doctor,
cool.
I think you'll probably get it. And it's about an hour-long segment on a guy. It's a physician who specializes in involving tech in medicine. And he does an hour-long where he got access to it and does live where he's playing it and narrating where are the therapeutic interventions, why are these happening, where is he seeing why this is actually differentiates between a video game and actual therapeutic intervention, and walks through the actual gameplay to be able to show how that works.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, I'll have to put a link in the description because I think that's really, it'd be cool to see how that works and see him kind of, or to follow along with how that works. Yeah. Interesting.
So I don't think I've ever heard the term digital therapeutics before. Have you heard that, Dr. G? Are you familiar with that concept?
Not used that way, no, yeah.
What's the culture around this stuff in med school? Did it come up at all? Was it emphasized? Was it even acknowledged?
Well, I mean, not that term. No, not in
but
my
training.
But
the implementation of technology and more direct kind of integration of technology in treating mental health.
Yeah, I mean, in my training, definitely as these things came up, it wasn't something that was as developed to be in, say, the didactics yet, at least in my program, but it was definitely something that came up kind of case by case, right? Which I think is kind of where we're at in this space anyways,
Pretty
right?
much.
Is trying to be, we kind of have, this path of what we know works best for a lot of people, right? The 80% maybe, and then it's the 20% where whatever reason it's not working, or we're going to try something different. Where can we be more advanced here? And it's this kind of discussion that we have to where can we pull the right resource to be there? And we got to add to that tool set, right? To kind of do that.
I love how it has me thinking how interesting it is that there's really no feedback loop in between therapy sessions on a week-to-week basis. And especially the more that kind of trying to invest in your mental health and improve upon your mental health aligns with how we go about doing that for physical exercise in our physical bodies. It's I couldn't imagine a exercise program or a fitness program that you would do one day a week for an hour. And so it's and this is what I think technology and therapy is going to do in many aspects, is get us to start rethinking about everything. Not only how we integrate it, but what can we learn from it to optimize what it is we've already been doing.
And I think that that's the key piece, is it really especially the last piece that you just mentioned, which is I have a very strong feeling that I'm not a fan of integrating tech just for the sake of integrating tech.
Yeah.
That I think is very problematic, because then you're trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. But it's to really be able to acknowledge of going, what does tech do well? And how can we use that to be able to do things that otherwise would be either very difficult or impossible to be able to do in therapy?
Well, and that's so much of the conversation we had about virtual reality.
Correct. Yep, was of for VR, it's how do we bring the outside world in? You can't really bring an MRI machine into the therapy room, but I can. Using VR, I can put you into an MRI machine, to be able to work with that. But in this space of looking at something like Endeavor RX, or even potentially Mightier, I'm not sure if they have a communication loop back to the data, but you can we're talking about how that adjustment of the therapeutic intervention between sessions, you can't really do that all that well as a therapist without the use of technology. The other part is that like that has an example of that instantaneous action by the client and reward. Bing! You get a coin. You get points. You just won 50 points or whatever it is. You're getting this immediate stimulus response that otherwise may not be present. It would have been delayed until they got back to therapy and said, good job. Or maybe the parent would miss giving the reinforcement or these types of things. That we can do those types of responses automatically. We can use it to remove the third-party arbiter, to remove that piece of a client going, you're just saying that to be nice. When it's going, no, either you pressed the button on time or you didn't. Either you shot the car or you didn't. You can start to be able to do these types of pieces. And then to Lucas, to your point, is to get the telemetry data as the week goes on. Using that type of system, if I saw the client on Monday and I was curious kind of how they're doing, I can pull up their data on Wednesday and be able to see, is this trajectory moving the way that we want? We can start to be able to do that type of interaction where otherwise if we didn't have that digital aspect with it, it would either be very difficult or next to impossible to be able to do those types of things.
It makes treatment planning fairly easy where you're like must reach checkpoint 6.
Yeah, well, and especially for things that actually have a somewhat of a leveling progression.
Yeah.
We can do things like that just like with Endeavor RX you can set it for the go, no go scenario where if you only shoot the red cars we can track that and they can establish thresholds of what does from baseline, what does acceptable progress mean before we then switch to task switching. So no longer it's the red car, it's the blue car. Now we're switching to they can set those thresholds of what is that response rate that we need before that next stage happens, which we do as therapists all the time of staging that progression. But you can use the technology to be able to do it automatically, more accurately, and better response. And I'm going to stop there.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And I like how it keeps the individual engaged in their development and progress, but it does it in a way where the therapist plays no part in it.
Correct.
Because as I'm thinking about the different ways we could implement some of this stuff into just general outpatient therapy, or that method of keeping the client more engaged and more feedback loops, it's not going to be your therapist texting you more or anything like that. That would be, I think you only need to see a therapist once a week.
Yes.
But to include other elements of, staying engaged and on top of that stuff. Like the client I see on Thursdays, I have no idea what they did on Tuesday.
Yeah.
No.
We didn't get to Tuesday.
We didn't. I think there's another aspect of that too, which is that engagement piece. It's going to sound wild and crazy, but we actually want clients to do these things.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to be sure that it's being done, and these therapeutic interventions, those underlying constructs that we're trying to work on, are being delivered in a way that the client's actually going to use them. The analogy, the way I was really thinking through of how to be able to explain this, it would be kind of the equivalent of if you started with a new physician, and the physician you found out said, I will only take scheduling and all communication with me by handwritten letter, and I'm also going to only inform you of everything that I need you to do and all your test results by handwritten letter. And that's the only way we're going to talk, and there's no telehealth and you have to come physically in. How many appointments do you think you would have?
I don't know. How much are stamps now?
Yeah, but if it's like going, okay, that is a valid way of communicating, but that's not how I engage with the world. That's not how I engage with communication, with information, with tasks. We have to do similar. As generations have a different relationship with technology, we have to recognize that if we don't align with how people engage with the world, they just won't show up. They're not going to do the things that we want, that we feel are going to be helpful. So we have to use the mediums that they're actually engaged with.
So I think, I kind of see that as a couple of different of the benefits of technology, right? One is this whole spectrum of engagement. Can we engage? And it's a question, should we engage? How much should we engage between session, right? And how much should we just let them live their life and integrate what we worked on in those sessions? And part of it is meeting people where they're at, right? And just the way that society moves and the time delay to follow the system, right? Like if you look at, some of the biggest trials on especially, being a child psychiatrist in child psychiatry and child therapeutics, like you look at those manuals, which are open source, like the Coping Cat, it's like archaic. It's like a coloring book, right? But at the same time, like that's what it takes to get evidence, and we don't have new evidence to that level of something new yet. At the same time, like people are, we can have a video game. Well, I mean, maybe another example of that is, Sparks. I don't know if you know that CBT video game out of New Zealand, I think, but they've got great data for that, and it follows like a lot of CBT skills. It looks horrible. Like, by the time you get all the data, technology to create just the visuals of it has advanced so far. And now we're looking at AI, so now we're talking about video games, and by the time we get enough evidence for these video games, we're going to be way beyond that, right? So like, how do we integrate these things,
Especially like meet them where they're at. It's like youth of today, if they see anything in low resolution, they think it's broken.
I'll throw up.
Like they think it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And they move on.
It's not a value.
And that's legitimate. And that's not something to ignore. And that's just so interesting too, just the amount of resources that got put into that, and none of it went toward the aesthetic.
And actually, that brings up, for both Dr. G and Lucas, the point that you were just touching on, I think is very important because it leads into another part, which is the difference between integrating these types of programs that are commercial off the shelf versus purpose-built. So like Endeavor RX and Mightier are purpose-built. These were designed specifically for therapeutic interventions, or the programs that we use, that Austin and I use for virtual reality. Those are all purpose-built for therapeutic interventions. Those are different than things that are commercial off the shelf. Like rather than playing sorry with a kid to be able to make them angry so you can like work on emotional regulation. I had a 10-year-old boy that I was working with anger management issues, and we played Fortnite, and there's nothing like pissing off a kid to have him get sniped. Get just pegged off in the head. Yeah. It was awesome. But that was taking a commercial off the shelf game.
Yeah.
And I had to adapt my therapeutic intervention to use it, which is different than the purpose built. There's a drawback. Often the purpose built look like crap. Because they're built to be therapeutic, they're not built for entertainment. So the commercial off the shelf will have often these really awesome gameplay mechanics, visuals, sounds, music. They're not the most therapeutic.
But do they know that? Like, do they know that if they design their exact same program, but to have an aesthetic that reflects more of what kids are accustomed to when they play a video game, that it would diminish the therapeutic effect?
Well, I think now you've seen Endeavor. What does that look like? I mean,
that one's actually not too bad.
It looks pretty good.
That one actually looks pretty good.
Okay, I was going to say Mightier looks like a normal video game.
Yeah. They're getting better at it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's just a caution that sometimes the ones that are designed for therapy, they're focused on therapy, they miss the game mechanics.
Yeah.
So anybody who plays video games is like, that's not how that's supposed to move.
Right.
Because they're so focused on the clinical outcomes that they miss the other pieces.
Oh, yeah. With the time course where we're at here, right? I mean, I don't know what their kind of project plan for Endeavor is, right? But you think about where we're at now, okay, like how many years until like they like get the local insurance company to pay for it? Once you can do that, then like we can give it to like a ton of people, right?
Yeah.
And by then, like, have they invested to update the graphics to what it is like a year from now, right? It's just like you have to manage both sides of it. Yeah. But I mean, on the flip side of the purpose built is like, how do we integrate tech into that purpose built a little bit better? On the other side, like how do we integrate moral psychotherapeutic aspects into just commercial built off the shelf stuff, like all the science that's going into making that addictive and catchy and rewarding in the way that's going to make you play and spend more money on it. Like, why can we integrate some of that science to know that it's going to make you feel better too?
Yes.
And is there value in some realm to like start to integrate in just the science of making games and stuff, right?
Totally agree.
That's a world. It's a profit-driven industry, and so I think we would have to build the case as to how it can become more morally intentional without diminishing at least too much of the profit, or just legislate it.
Yeah. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Mightier too, though, because I think it is. I had never heard of it until Dr. G brought it up to me, and it's very different than Endeavor RX. Like it serves some of the same purpose where people can. I think that it's for 6 to 12-year-olds and kids who have outbursts, anger, temper tantrums, ADHD, autism, that whole thing. But it's interesting because it's just an iPad game, and you have a monthly subscription, and they send you like a heart monitor that syncs to this game. And I was just like poking around their website, and I think the main purpose is like building coping skills, practicing breathing, trying to kind of regulate yourself. And it's just interesting to me that because they have a bunch of different games and like as your heart rate goes up, the games get harder. Mm-hmm. And then once it gets to there's a little corner of your screen that actually will show like your heart rate. And so then and I've never played this game. I've just kind of poked around the website, but it's so interesting because if your heart rate gets too high, if you're starting to get too angry, it'll kind of pause the game and walk you through like an exercise for coping and like bringing your heart rate back down. And so then you have this challenge to calm yourself. It's like the gamification of bringing your heart rate down and calming yourself down. And it like when you're looking at the science behind that, it seems like it's actually working too. I don't think it communicates to therapists, but it does communicate to parents. And so I would imagine that parents would be able to share some of that too. But I just am fascinated by like the use of some of these tools, in schools, in therapy, at home, all of these different things. And just, it just seems really cool.
But I think that fascination is an important part, and maybe too for, kind of the therapist listening is like just to kind of keep that curiosity, right? I mean, that, that specific example, it's like, even though I'm, interested in this stuff and, I hadn't come across that, and it came from a client,
Mm-hmm.
who's like, hey, have you ever heard of this? Like, should I be looking, like, is this a real thing? So then I look it up, right? And then I see it's from the group at Mass General, and it's got all this research behind
Yeah.
it. And then that, I kind of validate it through my lens.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm like, okay, that seems pretty reasonable. Why don't you tell me how that goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then also I've recommended it to a number of other clients, right?
Yeah.
As one of those tool things, right? So like some of the stuff that's on the forefront, we can find it awesome. At the same time, like we got to listen to clients and continue to be
So
curious
true.
there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and be open to it, and then we can kind of build it in.
So your clients that have used it, have they given you any feedback or told you what they think about it?
I've had some people who have found it really helpful. I have one parent who was like, they like beat it, or like, they were just good enough. They like blew right through it, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I've had a number of clients that have found it super, super helpful.
That's a really good point. So the Mightier people recommend that you only play it like 15 or 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week or something for 90 days.
Endeavor, too.
I was going to say, I thought Endeavor had
30 minutes per day.
And Endeavor actually, like the game shuts off, doesn't it?
It'll lock you out.
I don't think Mightier does that. And I think Endeavor, like that does make a lot of sense. Otherwise, if you're enjoying a game, you are just going to blow right through it. That makes sense.
If it's supposed to be therapeutic, it's just like you wouldn't sit with your therapist all day, or if
No.
you felt like Prozac was helpful, you wouldn't just take, a bunch of them, right? Like, but
Yeah.
video game, you're approaching it from a different avenue where
Yeah.
you're just like, well, sometimes I just don't play video games all day, so why not this one, right?
And especially because with looking at it from the therapeutic lens, part of why I think in part that we kind of keep it time delimited, besides very monetary reasons, but also we want them to be able to have it in a digestible amount. We don't want to give them a power bar full of like 50 different things and then expect them to be able to figure out what's what.
Yeah.
We want them to be able to have the experience, stop, be able to process it, deal with it, kind of work with it before engaging with it again. And
Yeah.
if they're doing a marathon, 8-hour session of it.
Well, they're probably not learning as much because that repetition is so helpful to actually like ingrain some of these skills.
Correct.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Is the point of that video game to play it as long as you can without getting aroused or escalated?
That's a good question. I don't know that answer. I mean, I don't think, they recommend that you play it 20 minutes a day. They don't recommend that you just see how long you can play it because the game doesn't.
But like it gets more hard
Yeah.
as you start to escalate.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't escalate at all, it's going to just be easy.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just, So is the goal to be able to stay in that non-aroused state?
I think the goal is to be able to bring yourself back down when you are.
Yeah, because it also seems to like almost in a manipulative kind of way, like intentionally escalate you.
Yeah, because it gets harder and
Yeah. So it's
yeah.
like you start to get a little escalated and then it just ramps it up even more. And so maybe just,
Well, it's just my thought is, and you're just articulating part of why I think tech is so important is it can monitor that escalation and it can calibrate to increase difficulty, I think, in a lot more consistent manner than just a therapist can, because it's kind of quantified and they've kind of gated what does more difficult look like and at what rate, how do you titrate that, that ramping, and then what are the thresholds to be able to say that you should ramp it or should you bump them back down to be able to do something else to relearn the skill. It can do that in a more objective way than I think even a human therapist would be able to.
Yeah. Going back to that window of tolerance and and just like making it challenging.
Yeah,
enough.
and really actually using the data of what is happening, not what our as the therapist perception is or the self-report of the kid or the parent is. It's actually using that to titrate, like you were saying, Lucas.
Which is a huge benefit, absolutely. Okay. At the same time, I mean, I think this brings up another good point, is that just because it's technology doesn't mean it's good, right? I mean, just because it's medicine doesn't mean it's good, and we see this in kind of naturopathic stuff too. Just because it's a supplement doesn't mean it's good for you, right? Like, in this situation, right, what you're saying is like, if you're exerting control, like that's the skill to, like, you kind of rev up, you exert control down, you learn that skill, right? But at the same time, like, if you just approach it where like, you're essentially numb,
brute force,
you excel at this game, right? But the goal is not to be numb. The goal is to like exert control, right? So, in some we all have to like take this with a grain of salt. Like situations, this can be helpful in situations it's actually not therapeutic, and that goes with everything we do, right? But like we don't want to ever approach anything that like this is good, this is bad, right?
And I was just going to say, I think that kind of is similar to the conversation we had about VR too, because it's Endeavor and Mightier and VR and these other technologies are tools. They're not like meant to be the whole therapeutic experience either, right? Like, I mean, it's really meant to come alongside to support I guess I can't speak to Mightier as much, but it's like, it is, these are, if we're viewing them as tools and how we as therapists can include them or, continue the work that we're doing with our client in other ways to supplement it, I think that that's key too.
And if we can cultivate that in our clients, that's a really useful framing of things, right? Because I mean, we all just want to be fixed, right? Or we all just want to be better, right? But it's like our brain doesn't work that way. It's super complex, right? And so, like, it's got to integrate into our life in between sessions. It's got to integrate in how we do things. And there's going to be a piece of it that's going to be this, and there's going to be a piece of it that's that. And, like, if we can all come to a place where we cultivate that way of approaching it, we're going to, we can go along the journey instead of just seeking a solution.
Because and similar to the physical body, I would love to just be in shape right now.
Right?
Like, if someone could just make that happen, I'd do it. But I mean, I've looked into every workaround out there. You're gonna have to exercise. I would have to start exercising and working out, eating healthier, and it's hard, And so when we look at our mental health, it's the same thing, and so it's exciting to see a lot of new innovations that are at least creating new avenues.
They help us be more consistent too.
Yeah.
And I think that it's that consistency that I think is part of where my appeal is with kind of that integrating in the tech, because therapists are human. We get distracted and we go down rabbit holes. Client comes in with something interesting, we kind of go wandering off, and we then kind of pull back, where we can use some of these things to be able to not only for our therapists, for our clients to be consistent, but also kind of keep us on track too, to be sure that we're kind of following the trajectory that we're supposed to.
Yeah.
But we have to, we have to be that way as therapists too. Like, we don't want to become machines, right?
Exactly.
Like, this is the whole spectrum of things,
Pendulum
like,
swing.
It's great to have the objective data to say, hey, did you meet this threshold in that game?
Yeah.
like you could probably become a robot and just do this. Like this could be your whole practice, right? Yep. You kind of manage numbers all day long, right? But then you kind of lose track of everything too, right? So it's like this whole balancing act.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what are some other technologies that you're seeing in this space? Like good, bad, ugly, great, all of it.
I can speak to part of, I think part of like where the digital therapeutics is coming from and that movement toward whether it should be FDA approved or how, but how to be able to get a little bit of oversight comes actually from some of the really bad things that have happened. Because tech right now, because it is a little bit of a wild west of how is tech integrated into health, I think it's a little bit more on the medical side, but on the mental health side, it's still pretty rough of anybody can create an app and they can do so. And there's been a couple of cases where we were talking just before the podcast of two of them that I can think of. One where they were trying to create, obviously somebody who'd never done substance use treatment, created an app to try to help people avoid triggering situations when dealing with substance use disorder. And so they geofenced areas where they're drug dealers in the hopes that people would get a warning to be able to go, don't go into this area because your favorite drug is being dealt. And any therapist can tell where that went. And they basically created a homing function for people to be able to find the best drug dealers.
The world's first app.
The first
to
app to find your drug dealers.
Live,
yeah, and it's live time telling you.
I'm sure it specified what drugs they're selling.
Yeah, actually, I think it did.
I don't know if it had the current market rates.
How did it know that?
It's just of like pockets of like where meth dealing is, and it was like
they probably partnered with law enforcement.
It reminds me of the Gas Buddy. Do you know app where it's like it tells you where all of the gas stations are and how much they are? And, oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's kind of along those lines. And so again, so you could see how somebody who said we want to get into the mental health and like substance use space, this sounds like a really cool idea, but probably never talked to anybody who works in the field to go, oh my God, this is a horrible idea, but they made it.
They could have talked to plenty of people.
Well, that's true too.
Who didn't have that foresight.
That's true.
I was giving therapists the benefit of the doubt there.
Yeah, don't do that.
Or another one that was an AI app that was created with the intent of if somebody's highly depressed, but it's like 3 a.m, they can't get a hold of their therapist, they can't call their social networks. At least they could have an AI bot that would do like basic CBT or things like that.
This is going to go well.
Yeah, it ended up that once the symptoms got bad enough, the AA started to tell them to drink. And so the AI went off the rails and started, it was not intended, it was not like developed in there, but it happened. And so, yes, this is part of like what Dr. G was talking too, of going, we have to be the ones who are looking at these pieces of like your client who was smart and brought it to you and said, is mightier. What do you think? We have to be, because we don't have that vetting process really established right now for this field, the onus is kind of on us to be able to determine, is this safe? Is this okay? Is there actually evidence to be able to support this? And then to Dr. G's point of going, and now how do we actually use it? I know what it says on the box, but like to your point of going, somebody could just numb their way through some of these pieces. Yeah. That's not what we want. And so we have to, I think especially in something that's emerging like this, we have to have a much more active role in how our clients are engaging with it or how we're bringing it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a different way of, kind of this discussion comes up in the medical field a ton, but, kind of practicing to your level of training.
Yeah.
And so, is our level of training really looking at numbers or like reading the box? No, our level of training is like evaluating things at a complexity level that integrates all of our intelligence, right? Yes. And so like if we can use these things to like heighten our practice and heighten our expertise to reach more people or reach them in the way that we can, or to leverage something that, in a better way, like that's, better use of our time and better for the clients.
Yeah, and I think it's really that clinical judgment. Yeah. Because, I mean, as we've been talking, at times it can seem like, at least for myself, that I can make it sound like this is a panacea and that this is just the most wonderful thing and there's no problems with it. That's just not the case. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of ways that this can go off the rails. What is it? Igneous harm, when the therapy actually causes harm. I can't remember the term. When the therapy itself causes it. I mean, it's just like in therapy, we recognize that some of the therapeutic interventions, even in talk therapy, if they're done incorrectly or done for the wrong reasons, wrong goal alignment, things like that, we can actually cause more damage.
Iatrogenic.
That's it. Thank you. God, I was
Wait, what is it?
Iatrogenic.
That's it.
I told you I'd be nerd hour.
That's right. Yes.
I'm also a linguistic guy. But this is not new. We tend to think of like demon tech. We have to kind of worry about the horrors of this, but seriously, you have to worry about the same problem with CBT. We just don't talk about it much.
Oh, I talk about that plenty.
Well, I know you and I have opinions about CBT, but we miss at times. I think that the therapeutic interventions that we're doing have as much risk as potentially integrating this tech, and we have to use both in similar ways.
Especially with AI. I mean, we haven't even come close to figuring that out for the general public, but to utilize it in therapy at this point, I'm shocked that even got approved for use. But I did ask.
Well, but who approved it?
I don't know.
That's the thing. Nobody did.
Oh, yeah, I guess therapy
the marketing,
world.
the marketing department, of some company approved it.
Wow. That should be a lawsuit then, because
I think it was.
Oh yeah,
the forces at play though. There's just a giant vacuum of need, and so I mean, we see this in all the realms. I mean, just people are suffering. We don't know how to make it better fast enough. We don't have enough people, right? So I mean, things are going to come into that gap. And we've got these tremendous tools. Which AI is a great example, but they're gonna come into that void, just out of the need for it, out of altruism, and it's not going to go well.
Or profit.
Both.
And so it could come from both ends. Profit-hungry companies seeing opportunities, and also people that are righteously, wanting to help by innovating ways to do so.
And missing the mark.
Yeah.
I did ask, I talk to ChatGPT all the time.
Oh, me too.
I asked it in like a tough guy voice. I was like, do you think you'd be a better therapist than me? And it said, because of my inability to experience human emotion, that'd be a significant limitation in an artificial intelligence system's ability to help other humans therapeutically. And I was like, that's right.
That's actually pretty
I'm glad
impressive.
we agree.
You inanimate object, you.
Yeah. And so, I think that's where I have to put a bookend on AI, or else this whole thing will derail quickly.
Yes, it will.
There was one technology.
I was tempted for a second. I'm like,
there was a technology that was pitched to me that I think is a brilliant technology. It's essentially a group of researchers coded a program to track. It'll record 30 seconds of someone's spoken dialogue, and within 90 seconds, it gives you like their exact stress level, like in that moment. And so it was pitched to me to implement in, maybe teletherapy, maybe our wellness consultations that we host. And so I was impressed with the technology, and the research was super solid. But as I thought about like what its use for a clinician's perspective, to know what your client's stress level is just in the immediate moment. It's like, how truly helpful is that? How truly helpful would that be? And I couldn't really come up with an answer, because of one, if they're stressed, they're probably telling us that, or we can sense it because we're tuning to them because we're therapists. Even, in a teletherapy platform, there's still body language. And so with that piece, but also, and therapy is not a generalizable environment. So when they're sitting down talking with their therapist, that should ideally be at least one of the less stressful environments that they exist in. But it got me thinking, like how, and this ties into what we were talking about earlier, like how can we get more feedback and data points? Like I think it could be great if I could see patterns of a client's stress levels as it fluctuates on a weekly basis and start to identify patterns. And tie it to context and situations and people. That would be super helpful.
It's in progress. Okay. It was actually at the APA conference this last year here in Minneapolis. They actually went to a session that was talking about they're working with the military. It was psychologists who were working with the military, and they adapted a smartwatch and then adapted the program, and they worked with whoever the smartwatch maker was to be able to really calibrate how they were going to operationally define stress, a stressful event. But then they were using the GPS tracking plus time plus the stress markers to be able to map their week and be able to start to see, why is it on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock you always lose it? Why does this suddenly spike? Oh, I meet with my boss. Or, I mean, that one's a little bit more obvious, but they would be like, why is it that you're fine all day, but at 4 p.m., this just goes off the chart? Oh, I go home.
Yeah.
What's going on at home?
Yeah.
Well,
You
I
know,
think
That's great.
And so they were, but what was cool is because they were using, like you were saying, to be able to go, how can we use this then to be able to track what is unperceived by the client? Because probably if they came to session, you said, how did you notice any patterns this week? They'd be like, no, because that's kind of the point, is they're not attending to the things that we
They're
would.
in it.
Or they're not, yeah, they're in the middle of it. They can't see the pattern
Yeah.
from the side of it. But so to your answer of going, yeah, no, that's coming.
Yes, I can't wait to see you in 4K big screen with that face you were making as I was talking about this. And I'm glad that that's already in process, one, so we could use it sooner, and two, because I really shouldn't be throwing away intellectual property on here
Well,
in the case that was an original idea.
the funny thing too is, like, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about how I don't think we've ever even talked about like John Gottman stuff on here. Do you? I don't know. I love one of his books, but I like, that's kind of what he does in his research, where he records couples having conversations.
He has a B&B that's just
Facial
a lab, isn't it?
expressions, like they can predict divorce at a 97% threshold by just having a computer analyze someone's facial expressions.
Yeah, but even
It's
before they,
insane.
like, I mean, they've been doing this for decades, and for a while it was just analysts that were looking at, like, oh, that's a 4,
Coding.
you know, that exactly. And so it makes sense that we're moving into a place that computers can now do that, and like we can use that data in other places, because because we've been able to kind of do that on a smaller scale,
But
and
even,
predict that.
you know, to take it away from the client and back, you know, off of your feedback comment, Lucas, is, you know, bring it back to the therapist. Like, we don't get enough feedback on our interventions, right? So, like, if we can use some of that data to say, hey, whatever you did that session, bingo, right? Then you can kind of, then it kind of build
I
your
actually hadn't
own,
thought about
right?
that angle. That's really cool.
You know, just to kind of build our own practice and expertise in
Interesting.
what we're all doing. Because oftentimes, you know, the client kind of sees us and then they go off into the world. It's the same thing. We do something with the client, then they go off into the world and we're not quite sure, you know.
Didn't land.
Right.
Yeah.
Did they actually integrate it?
Until like 10 sessions later, they go, you know, that one time you said that, and I've been thinking about that a lot. And you're like, ooh, tell me more. What knowledge did I give you?
And I thought that didn't land well.
Right,
So I moved on to something
Or
else.
even like, I didn't remember saying that.
Yeah, that's always fun.
Well, this has been a really cool discussion. Thanks for joining again and talking through more of this. I don't know if you have any other questions or thoughts, Lucas.
Well, I'd say, LJ, you've formally passed your interview into the innovation lab that Dr. G and I host. So can't wait to
Absolutely.
have you there. You're going to love it.
Very awesome. Looking forward to it, man.
Yeah. Thanks for joining, guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right.